And yet, here's something that I think we need to think about. Whenever we consider these possibilities, we need to constantly be mindful of the fact that we love to scare the hell out of ourselves.
Warning, this is not entertainment.
There is a war against masculinity. You might have heard this narrative before. It's kind of popping up more and more in culture and in different places around social media and even mainstream media now more and more I'm starting to hear it. But is it true? You know, it's a narrative that's been gaining momentum in recent years, but is there anything to this claim that men are being persecuted? And what direction are they being persecuted from? Is it modern culture? Is it some sort of progressive agenda? Is it just a natural reaction to changes in society and the way we live our lives in the 21st century? There's a lot of questions to ask around this, and there's a lot of themes that we can unpack. And to do that, I wanted to bring my good friend and occasional guest back on the podcast, Dave Greenockle, who is somebody who's very wise and looks into these types of big abstract questions about, you know, changes in society, the way we live, the things that we value, and he might be able to give a fresh perspective, something that, you know, I haven't thought about, or maybe you as a listener haven't thought about, and help us kind of dive in deep and figure out what actually is going on. What is the subversive change that's taking place within culture and then within us as individuals? So let's jump right into it. My friend Dave is back on the podcast today. It's been a few months since we talked to him, and I think this is going to be a good one, especially for you men out there, but for women as well. I think you'll get something out of this because these are ideas and issues that Dave and I have both thought about, but these are probably conversations that the men in your life are talking about. So if you're not a man, if you're a child or a woman, don't feel like you need to tune out because I think this is going to be applicable to everybody. But let's get right into it. Dave, what do you think, man? Does modern culture have an issue with manhood? Is it in the crosshairs of the modern world, so to speak?
Yeah, I absolutely do. And first, it's just a pleasure to be back on the show. I've been listening to your podcasts, you know, pretty regularly, and they're awesome, man. So it's just an honor to be back. But yeah, I mean, you know, we've been talking about this, you know, on camping trips, on phone calls. I mean, we've talked about this in length, and you know, I do think that manhood is under threat. But you know, I think there's a couple caveats, you know, to begin this discussion that we really need to just throw out there, and the first thing is, you know, a lot of times when we're talking about manhood and masculinity and in this kind of context, you know, people could have a tendency to tear down women or even go up against the stream of feminism. And I don't want to do that. I mean, I truly do believe in true feminism, and that is the social, economic, and political equality of women with men. I think that's a very masculine approach, you know, as a man, to be able to uplift the human character of female. So I want to really make sure that, you know, that your listeners, you know, don't think that that's our intent, because that's obviously not what we're going for, you know?
Right. Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up right at the outset, because I think a lot of times when you talk about any sort of, issue with one of the sexes, whether it be, you know, changes in perceptions about what it is to be a woman, you know, in the 20th century, we went through a lot of that with, you know, a lot of, obviously the feminist movement really taking place there, and women going into the workforce, and then you have, equal pay for equal work, and, you know, all sorts of pushes around gender equality. It's kind of set up as this juxtaposed arrangement where men and women are kind of pitted against each other as, you know, opponents in the gender wars. But I don't think that's what this is about. And I think it's really important for you and I, right, to kind of lay that out at the onset, because you and I are both fathers of young daughters, and like you, I want my daughter to grow up as, you know, a strong-minded woman who understands her place and her value, more importantly, in the world, and not to think that this idea of masculinity is any sort of threat to her or to her maximizing her potential in her own existence. I think when we talk about masculinity, it gets conflated easily with toxic masculinity.
No, absolutely, and that was going to be the second caveat is that what are we talking about when we are discussing masculinity, and obviously that's what today's show is about. But I do believe that there should be a war on toxic masculinity. The you can't even call it masculinity, so we preface it with toxic masculinity, but the masculinity of abuse, of abusive power. Tearing down women, sexual promiscuity, violence, abuse in any form, emotionally, verbally, physically, or even with a substance. And it's kind of weird to be talking about such things in the context of manhood, because that's not what it means to be a man. But it fits underneath the guise of the notion of toxic masculinity, which there definitely should be a war on. But, we have to be careful, because there's a line that needs to be drawn between true masculinity and keeping that separate from a toxic masculinity. So, you were saying, is manhood under threat? And I think in many regards it is. I don't think it's necessarily coming from a female perspective, because that just buys into the notion of, feminism being bad. What I really do think is that manhood is under threat because of two reasons. One, because of society. I think we as a culture have mistaken what masculinity is. We haven't really done a good job in promoting the notion of masculinity to the next generation. So one is simply a societal problem that has been generated, and the second one is an identity issue. Essentially, I feel that because of society, because of a lot of different things, I think most men, including myself, up until relatively recently, I think, I'm still trying to get a handle on it, have a misconstrued understanding of their own personal identity.
Mm. Yeah, personal identity is something that a lot of us, will wrestle with our entire lives, for a number of reasons, right? Because, if you don't have a strong male figure in your life, a father, grandfather, whatever it may be, that that can be tough, trying to find your way through life, claw your way through life. So just speaking from my own experience, primarily raised, by women. My parents split up young. I had a stepfather in my life who came into the picture at a pretty young age. But, for the most part, I think my upbringing was a raising by women. So this idea of discovering your identity as a man without a man, to kind of shepherd you through that process or show you what the expectations are, what, the model looks like that you should follow. I think that's tough. And if we look around, society now in the 21st century, I don't know the exact statistics, you might know better than me, but a large proportion of households, like a crazy statistic of young boys and girls who are growing up in households without fathers. And, that's got to be a huge factor in this idea of not having a true understanding of identity, as a man and as a woman. And then not only that, but, the idea of what you said with true feminism. I think where feminism goes too far is where it draws a line with complete egalitarianism, right? So feminism wants men and women to be equal. And this is one branch of feminism, but this is kind of like the most extreme view, that men and women should be equal in all aspects, right? There's really no difference between a man and a woman, that a woman can do anything a man can do, vice versa. The problem with that is that it's just objectively not true. It's like, physiologically speaking, men and women are different. There's differences between us. We have different, chemical makeups that drive us and drive our thought process, drive our actions, drive our abilities. And that becomes a problem when you really start blurring that line between the genders. It doesn't mean one's better than the other. There's just things that men can do that women can't do, that women can do that men can't do. Like, there are plenty of things that, women excel men at, and nobody really seems to have an issue with that. But with the shoe on the other foot, I think feminism is pushing to this idea where, well, you can't say one gender can do something that another can't. So that kind of lends even more weight toward this issue of identity. It's like, well, if we're all the same in every capacity, then like, what the hell am I supposed to be? Because I feel, as a man, like I have this primal thing inside of me that's, wanting to, live a certain way that's not really kosher in modern society. I think, you see a lot of frustration, especially around young males, young adults, because of that. Like, they don't feel like they have an outlet for what used to be considered just basic, basic manhood.
Yeah, absolutely, man. Funny enough, to start off this conversation with probably one of the ultimate grandmothers to the feminist movement. Ayn Rand, the writer, female writer, portrays very, very strong female protagonists in her writings. She's one of my favorite philosophers and one of my favorite writers. She has a quote that I think may be able to get us started in this, and it is, "The smallest minority on earth is the individual. Those who deny individual rights cannot claim to be defenders of minorities." And I think this is part of the societal problem where we are lumping everyone into categories, which, fine, there are categories. But we need to look at people as individuals with individual desires, individual gifts, and individual responsibility. And I think that's where the societal and identity problem has come out of, is that we failed to really look at people, whether male or female, as really individuals with certain rights and responsibilities as a human being. So, we started to see this, excuse me, a little bit. It's kind of this societal, cultural paradox that began, and in a sense, with manhood being under threat. And I think a better way to really look at this for the listeners is, I really think more than manhood being under threat, I think adulthood is really under threat.
Right.
I think when we really are talking about manhood being under threat, I think really what at the base and the foundation of this is that boys particularly don't know what it means to develop into a man. And then there are societal pressures and societal institutional things that are happening that are keeping essentially men and women, but for our conversation, men particularly, in a childlike state. Example, I was just looking up the definition of a man. Merriam-Webster states, a manhood is the state of or period being a man rather than a child. And so, what's a child? A child is a being that is dependent upon another. An adult is someone who is somewhat or completely self-reliant. So we see this in society. For example, in the 1950s, there was a major cultural societal switch in this understanding of manhood and really adulthood. And what happened in the 1950s, because of the affluence of America, kids were able to now not have to go out and work on the farm. They didn't have to go out to the factory. Essentially, there's so much money in America that's being generated that parents don't really need kids to go and get a job.
Right.
And so in the 1950s, we call it the decade of the birth of the teenager. Essentially, obviously there's always been a teenage numerical value. But in the 1950s, when you're 14, 15 years of age, you can go to the diner, you go to the sock hop, you can listen to rock and roll. Your parents have created a life, and culture has created a context for you to stay in childhood. Just 10, 20, 30 years earlier in American society, man, you're 14, 15, 16. It's like, it's time to get up in the morning, milk the cows, go to school maybe, get home and work in order for your family to survive. You don't need that anymore. And so what we actually have here is a new stage of development for kids in the 1950s. Now it's no longer you're a kid, now you're an adult. Now you're a kid in like this really strange time period being a teenager,
Yeah, it's almost, with the rise of the quote-unquote nanny state, you have a rise of this identity crisis, not just for men, but also for women. Like you said, as you were actually talking about, Ayn Rand, the thought popped into my head about, I wonder if this idea of, I guess confusion, like existential crisis levels of confusion about, meaning and purpose and your individual place in the world. I wonder if any of that's tied to almost treating people, like cattle. So I don't know when Social Security numbers started being tied to people, but, just using that as one example. Like every person,
I think it was like 1933, 1936, somewhere around there.
Okay, so it's not too far away from, the birth of the teenager era, the 50s. But then, everybody has a Social Security number attached to them. And then people start getting credit cards in the 60s and 70s. Like, you literally, at some point in the last 100 years, we became numbers. I mean, all of us just really became more of a number, a data point than anything else. I mean, especially as we moved away from an agrarian society, like you talked about, with kids getting up in the morning to milk the cows, etc. A lot of that still happens in rural America. I mean, you go into the heartland or any of the traditional red states, there's still a lot of that, but not nearly as much as it used to be. And I wonder how much of that, has really tied into this idea of, the threat or the war against manhood, because, I think it's an empirical fact that, as men become less attached to the earth, so to speak, as they become less reliant on, providing and, performing those manual labor jobs, that their perceptions as men change in the eyes of culture, in the eyes of society. So I'm thinking of this quote from a guy named Frank Miniter, who wrote a few books on the topic of masculinity, but he actually says, and I'll just paraphrase him here, that we like to point the finger at feminism or point the finger at cultural shifts when it comes to the idea of men no longer being men, but it really, it's not that at all. A woman wearing pantsuit or carrying a briefcase is not the problem with men becoming more effeminate or concerned with things that aren't considered quote unquote masculine. That is the result, and solely the result, of men being detached from the earth, and being too closely associated with cities or the pavement, and not really having to figure out where their food's going to come from, or having to go out and hunt for the sake of the tribe, having to defend the women and the children in war because the neighboring tribe might attack you. Like, as we've gotten away from that into these larger techno-driven societies, the idea of what it means to be a man's changed, because men don't have to carry that mantle anymore. And it makes me wonder, is the world that we've created, this, post-industrial, golden age where we have abundance of seemingly everything, I wonder if that's really the culprit in terms of men no longer being quote unquote men. Is that really what's taking us into the brink of, gender identity crisis, where men don't know what it is to be men anymore, and likewise women don't know what it means to be women anymore? Society lies to women as well, where we say a woman has to be able to do it all, right? She has to be able to go out, make a six-figure job, have benefits, and also raise a family. She's expected to put on appearances, and I feel bad for women in the modern world, because they're expected to literally do it all, and men have kind of the opposite problem, where they're supposed to kind of dial it back and make room for the women. But, there's something genetically in both of the genders where, men want to provide, and a lot of women out there, people might not like to hear this, want men to provide for them. It's been the way of humanity for thousands of years. So, in the matter of less than 100 years, we're expecting both genders to completely just flip that notion on its head and make it work. And, you're seeing society trying to work a lot of that out. And meanwhile, all of us are being perceived by our society as, just another person waiting in line with a ticket. We have a number associated with us, and it's really all society cares about is how they can use us to make a profit, right?
Yeah, I mean, you just said, so many good things. But, I think what it comes down to is, in my opinion, hearing this from you is, kind of two things, and that is goals, right? Humankind, but particularly mankind, needs we need goals, right? We need a goal to achieve, and if you don't have a goal to achieve, real, tangible goals, man, not I'm just gonna work and make money and live in my house, but real soul searching goals, you're gonna have an identity problem. And the second thing is, you're discussing the detachment from the land, and I think the detachment of the land is in part the goal, the lacking of goal, right? So, the great prophet and sage of Joshua Wisely and Dave Greenockle is Thomas Jefferson, right? I mean,
yes, sir.
We can always go back to him, and his whole premise of 40 acres and a mule, right? I mean, what we have here is, if you're tied to the land, the reality is you are not nearly dependent upon the state as you would be if you're not tied to the land. I mean, so, Jefferson and his very democratic, local, autonomous government utopias, if you will, is built off that premise. I mean, you have a family living on a farm, a man, a woman, kids, they all have goals. those goals are to be completely self-reliant because there's no one else around to help you. So, I think a detachment from the earth creates this dependency upon other people. The globalist kind of view and the universalist view is like, that's a good thing, right? We're all tied together and we're all interlocking our economies and we're all dependent upon one another. In some regards, that could be good. I mean, Woodrow Wilson thought that would be a way to create some kind of peace on planet Earth. Okay. But there's also the notion of when you are so interwoven with other people, where's your really tangible goals? And two, where's your self-reliance? And, this is just getting more complex in the modern age. I mean, we're just talking about the 1950s and teenagers, but let's talk about the 2000s. Now, we have this thing called, the boomerang kid, right? The kid that gets thrown out to college and comes flying back home because he's got so much debt, which is once again a Jeffersonian principle, right?
Yeah. Jefferson warned that, if you're strapped down with debt, that really that'd be your primary concern in life, and it would just consume every waking moment to the point that, you couldn't pursue anything else, let alone be a functioning, man in society who leads civically, who leads in his household, all these variables. It's like if you take on 40, 50 grand in debt, like many students do nowadays just to get through school, of course they're going to have problems with identity because they're 30 years old, forced to live with their parents. Of course they don't feel like men or women for that matter.
Yeah. So, it's this, once again, it's society creating context for people to have confused identities, right? So now you're 24, 25, 26, 30 even, living at home, living in your parents' basement, which I'm not necessarily poking fun at these people, but, you have just prolonged childhood. And you're like, oh, they're not children. Well, yeah, really, they kind of are because they're dependent upon a parent to provide for them. Somewhere in the 2010, 12-ish, I believe, you had the Affordable Health Care Act, which one of the footnotes to it, I think it was built underneath that bill. It might have been right before it. I forget, but maybe your listeners can email us and let us know. But there was a provision that by law, every parent was able to insure with health insurance, their children up until the age of 26 years of age, right? Yeah. Because people that were 20, it's crazy. I mean, when my parents were 26, they had a job, they were working, they had 2 kids, they were self-reliant. And I don't want to look, everyone makes fun of the millennials, and okay, we can have a lot of fun with that. I think we actually kind of did a podcast on that, but the reality here,
I technically am a millennial, so
yeah,
I try not to be too hard on them.
I hear you, but I don't want to I don't want to completely blame them, but I also don't want to dissolve them of level of responsibility. But what I'm trying to get at here is, right, we're talking about, is manhood under threat? And I think that there are 2 reasons for it. One societal, one identity. They're interwoven. And our society has created the economics and the political forces that are essentially, yet again, creating another stage of development for children, right? 1950s, teenager. 2000s, it's like this boomerang kid thing where you're biologically an adult, you're in your peak years for reproduction, but yet you are not completely self-reliant or not self-reliant at all. And I think a large of this goes back to, what you're saying, a detachment from the land, because, being a farmer, being connected to the land, you're going to be pretty self-reliant. If you're not self-reliant, the reality is you're going to die.
Yeah, and thinking about this idea of being attached to the land, I don't want to talk about it strictly in terms of an agrarian society. I know that might turn off a lot of listeners because some of you have never known agrarianism at all. Like I had the fortune of growing up on a farm. So my parents are grape farmers. My stepdad still to this day, runs a large grape farm, and he's out there, all year round, basically working with his hands, laboring, getting up early. We had cows at one point. We've had all sorts of farm animals, and seeing that sort of life and the hard work that goes into it, you appreciate it a lot more. You see where your food comes from. I grew up in an area where there were a lot of dairy farmers, and you see that. You see where the milk comes from, how it stocks the grocery store shelves each week, and you appreciate it. But many of us more and more now, as people begin, continue to flock to the suburbs and to society, to major metropolitan areas, you really, don't understand or appreciate that. It's kind of just like this magical event, each week or each month where this 18-wheeler shows up at your grocery store and stocks it, but you have no perception of where that stuff comes from. So, that's one, tentacle of it, of what it is to be attached to the earth. But it kind of, not so much in a hippie woo-woo kind of way, even though, I really am kind of sympathetic to that perception, but also in a, just like a naturalist, like a woodsman kind of way. Like, I really appreciate those who know nature, engage with nature, like the transcendentalists like Thoreau, Emerson, those kind of guys who wrote about the importance of nature, and it really turned a whole generation of white collar businessmen onto, understanding what it means to be a creature who is a part of nature and not an observer of nature. That's important, and we've really gotten away from that in the last few generations, where, most of us spend all of our time under a roof. We, go to jobs in a car where our bodies are literally just vehicles to transport our brains, and we sit behind a desk, and that neon screen slowly sucks our soul into this electronic ether, where it's like we can't, that can't be healthy. Like, that's messed up. Like, that cannot be healthy. A body is made to move. A body wants to move. So, like, one small practice that, and this is going somewhere, I'm not going too far off on a tangent for those of you
Okay.
wonder where I'm going with this, but something that I started practicing, just in the last few months, and this will sound weird, but like walking outside in my yard, not wearing shoes so much. So, there's actually nerves in the feet.
You getting into grounding, man? Is that what you're doing?
Kind of. Check this out. So I actually heard this from somebody else who does it, and my wife does this too. She never wears shoes outside. And this is something that I never really did, but it's really important and it's really valuable because you strengthen the nerves in your feet where you actually become like one with the ground in some weird way. Like you start to like, notice like differences. And this is going to sound wild, but I mean, I've done a little bit of research on this, and I think there's something to it. Like, so
Totally.
in Native American culture, a lot of the hunters, they would take off their moccasins and they would literally like hunt on foot. And this idea of like the Native American having like leathery soles to their feet, like it's kind of a stereotype, but there's some truth to it because, not only do your feet get stronger, but like the nerves in your feet actually like there's something in it. It releases a chemical in the brain that really like causes your performance to peak. So like this is something that sounds like so far out into left field now where like we wouldn't even talk about it or think about it anymore. But like something as simple as just like having your feet touch actual ground rather than pavement has been shown to have tangible results in terms of changing your perception of nature and your alertness levels and how you engage with the earth. So like something like that could help you become a better hunter or help you be able to predict weather patterns better. Like that's crazy to think about. So I'm just using that as one example of what it is to get away from the earth. But like even if you're not an agrarian farmer, if you spend all of your time under a roof, you never go out and get any vitamin D from the sun. You never walk around barefoot on grass. You never, put your hands in soil. It's so easy to start, having that identity crisis of wondering, what the hell am I here for? What's my purpose? What's my value? Because man is not a creature who is, designed to usurp nature or to be an observer of it. As I said, man, in every tangible facet is intended to be a participant in nature, in the order of, of the world, the order of, the animal kingdom, so to speak. So as a hunter, as, somebody who tills the land, somebody who, masters a craft, whether that be woodwork or masonry, something like that. Like everything you've ever seen out or that's been built has been built by men. And that's because men were part of society for thousands and thousands of years. Now, like we're trying to build things through a computer screen. We're all basically, we're building social networks. We're building products that are abstract and intangible a lot of times. We're trying to make the marketplace work more efficiently. That's all great. But those things are not observable in the natural world. So I'm going down a rabbit hole here. But in reality, I think that, the separation from what it is to be a part of the earth, to be able to, notice the different variety of trees, notice the different types of flowers, the different, variants of soil in the ground, like those things might sound mundane, but I'm finding more and more that they're absolutely crucial in the development, of manhood and womanhood, for that matter. The idea of, becoming an adult, you really have to know your place in the world. And I think none of us really know it because we're observing the world behind window panes most of the time.
Yeah, man. On the foot thing, going back to that for your listeners, 2 fantastic books on that subject would be Born to Run by Chris McDougall. An incredible book on the Tarahumara in western Mexico that run pretty much barefoot. Phenomenal book, even if you're not a runner. And then another book called Why You Run, which is a biological, evolutionary view of why you should be running. So 2 really cool books, but I just wanted to throw that out there. But, I think when we're getting down to it, you even threw out there like being a woodsman and going out hunting and being involved in the soil. And, what about someone that lives in the city? I mean, I guess they could have a garden on the rooftop. But what I think really when we break it down, at least is the way I view it, is when you're engaged in those natural environments and you're involved in the soil and you're involved with what our ancestors did for so long, there's a lot of goal setting, right? There's a lot of adversity. There's a lot of difficulty. There's a lot of overcoming physically, not just mentally. But I think that's something that we're missing out on, is that we do a lot of physically difficult things, but we do a lot of mental difficult things, but we don't necessarily do physically difficult things. And I think this is part of what it means to be a man. I mean, we do have testosterone. We do have a Y chromosome. I mean, there's something built inside of us where we should be doing something physical with our body. And I think if you're sitting in front of that screen and you're not going out to the gym, or you're not trying something new physically, or running, or engaging in some way, you don't have these very natural bioevolutionary goals that our ancestors have been doing forever. And I think particularly when men don't have that, man, it creates a really bad situation where men don't understand the goal or the responsibility.
I was listening to the Joe Rogan podcast not too long ago, and I forget who the guest was, but he said something really profound that validates what you just said, and immediately came to mind, because he said happiness is progress. And what he meant by that was, if you're not doing something difficult, if you're not progressing each day, trying to get better at something, you won't be happy. So we look to material things in modern Western culture for happiness, right? We look to money, status, power, whatever. We think those things will give us happiness, but when we attain them and they become a normal part of life, the happiness factor wears off rather quickly. But if you want to maintain a level, I guess happiness probably isn't even the right word, because happiness is an emotion like all others. It's fleeting.
And contentment, right? Maybe?
Yeah, contentment or satisfaction. I think that's a good word. If you want to feel satisfied or fulfilled from day to day, you need to progress. You need to progress at something. You need to get better at something. So whether that be physical fitness, if you're a runner, if you're a weightlifter, if it's a martial art or something like that, which I want to talk about in a minute here, just practicing incrementally each day, getting better. If you're a bow hunter, practicing with your bow each day. Yeah, that makes you happy. Like, it fires off endorphins and it fires off chemicals in the brain, right, that make you feel better. And on the flip side of that, if you're spending each day, playing video games for 6 hours, or working a job where you're just typing numbers on a keyboard for 6 or 8 hours into Excel spreadsheets, well, you can do that for a little while, but if you're not supplementing that with some sort of rigorous discipline, some sort of activity that's going to challenge you and stimulate your body and your mind, well then, hello depression, my old friend, because it's right around the corner. Like, it's going to creep up on you.
Oh, absolutely. Too many people work on, the big picture of things and not the small steps to something. I mean, our society is built on that largely, and we don't get to see these small incremental goals and steps to solving things. And fine, you're building a new piece of software at your industry job. I get it. That's part of that's there, but the physicality piece to it, I just think with testosterone levels particularly, I'm not a scientist, right? But like, there's got to be something there, and we're not getting that because we live a very subdued lifestyle, and our bodies and our minds and our spirits haven't caught up to that. I mean, this is what it means to be human, right? To be engaged with things. And you mentioned a little bit about martial arts, and I started Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu back in January, and I have been getting my butt handed to me. I mean, handed to me.
You're being a little modest, though. You've been tapping some people out too, I hear, right?
Well, see, this is where I'm going with it. So, for your listeners, I'm a white belt. I am like nothing. I am like meat for the guys on the mat, right? But there's a point to this, and that is, I'm being honest. I have never felt, even though I'm getting beat up, I have never felt so much pleasure in just making steps towards a goal. I mean, the humility that getting beat up gets you. One, trying to mentally figure out how to get better, and to then watch that you are slowly getting better. Has I'm telling you, it's been one of the deepest spiritual. I'm telling you, I can't even explain it. One of the deepest spiritual events in my life. To face an adversity and to like overcome it. I mean, just this last Monday, I went up against some guys, and I tapped a guy out twice, which I couldn't believe. And my professor, you call the sensei, you call him a professor in jiu-jitsu. I was just in the middle of tapping a guy out on a kimura, or just a certain move, an arm lock, and in the corner of my professor's eyes, I saw him look at me, and there was like this little grin and this little twinkle that was just like, hey man, you've gotten your butt kicked, but you're making steps towards a goal. And I'm telling you, man, I'm still running off of that high. I mean, the guy, the sensei, the professor is younger than I am. He's a black belt. He's younger than I am. And when this guy gave me that little look, I've never felt more validated. Maybe this is wrong, right, to say this, but validated and good in a really long time, because it was like, through difficulty, getting through something, just a small incremental step. I mean, I'm going to go to the studio tomorrow. I'm going to get my butt kicked again, but I'm going to relish on what just happened 2 days ago. Yeah.
So hearing your journey over the past few months about jiu-jitsu has meshed with some of the things I've heard from other people who I admire and listen to through podcasts and other forms of media who are also into jiu-jitsu, and it's made me want to get into it. I did Muay Thai kickboxing for a season, and that helped with physical fitness and discipline, but it from what I've observed, it's nothing like jiu-jitsu. And guys like Jocko Willink, who you and I both highly respect. He has a podcast.
Absolutely.
He's a Navy SEAL. Yeah. Maynard James Keenan, a famous musician. He's the lead singer of a few bands, Tool, A Perfect Circle, a couple others. But he's also a very, very disciplined jiu-jitsu practitioner, as well as a winemaker, which is kind of cool. And Joe Rogan, another guy that we, he's very much into that world of BJJ. They all say the same thing, that it's those incremental gains that you really, you can't hide your real self, so to speak, when you're out there on the mat. Correct me if I'm wrong here, but like there's no hiding, like there's no pretending, there's no shortcuts, like everything is revealed. You can't lie, you can't hide. And that's something that I think men have really lost in the modern world, right? Because there's so many opportunities in most public forums for shortcuts. There's so many.
Absolutely.
Yeah, right. In fact, it's praised almost like as a virtue, right? So like, if you get to your station in life through a shortcut, like other people want to emulate you. Like, what's the quickest way with the least resistance that I can get from A to B, right? So whether that be in finance or politics, whatever, people want the quick, easy road. But there's something in men that protests against that. There's something in men that wants to, aim higher and try for that more difficult task, because it's the journey, it's not the destination that makes you into a man. And I think,
absolutely.
Right. Yeah.
I'm sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off. I was just agreeing with you.
No. I think that's the end of the thought, really. It's just, as I'm thinking about you and jiu-jitsu and, just the discipline and the rigor with, with any sort of, physical, rigorous activity. So say you're a football player or any sort of athlete, right? So you're going to hear that same theme pop up when they talk about, their journey. It's the discipline. Military, you're going to hear that with soldiers a lot too. It's the process, so to speak.
Yeah, I think like this is kind of where we're getting at. And, I don't want your listeners to think I'm like egomaniacal. When I mean I get my butt kicked, I mean I get my butt kicked by some 50-year-old or some 20-year-old who's got like 40 pounds less weight or muscle on them. And because of the technique and their diligence, they beat me up. Yeah. But to be careful for the podcast, we're throwing out football, we're throwing out jiu-jitsu, we're throwing out hunting, we're throwing out archery, we're throwing out like being a woodsman and wood carving and all that kind of stuff, which is very like whoa manhood, But I want to be careful because what I think is being a man does not mean that you do those things.
That's a good point. So yeah, let's bring it back to that. What is, I guess, the benchmark? Is there a benchmark? What does it mean to be a man in any sort of universal sense?
Well, I think it's, we're throwing out all these things that fine, maybe you and I are into, right? But maybe there's guys out there that are just not into that stuff. And that does not mean that they are not a man and they're not masculine. I think when we're talking about this, what are all those things that we were throwing out there? Even like 40 Acres and a Mule and Thomas Jefferson, what the common theme is discipline. Mm-hmm. So a man or an adult is one who is disciplined in their physical being. I mean, they don't have too much weight on them, right? They're disciplined in that. They're disciplined in their emotions. They're not allowing their emotions to get out of control. They're disciplined in their mind and where their thoughts go. So I think discipline is a virtue of manhood that is to be found in anything that you do. I think the other piece of the puzzle here is some semblance of self-reliance. Look, I think I'm a man. Am I reliant on people sometimes? Absolutely. I'm not, on an island by myself. I am reliant on people. But the missing link here is the gaining and walking out responsibility. And I think that's the benchmark. Discipline, a semblance of self-reliance, but maybe a better way to put it is bearing responsibility.
Let me ask you this. So I think most of what you just said, though, could be applied to, like you said, adults in general, men and women. So the demarcation line between manhood, which you and I think agree is under some sort of assault by the modern world, I think there has to be a step further there. Maybe it's the self-reliance piece, but I would also lump in, being a provider and being a protector. And that doesn't have to take the form of, being a skilled hunter or, being able to kick somebody's ass with jiu-jitsu techniques. It just means that there has to be some level of, I'm where the buck stops, right? The man has to be right. The one who, is the last defense line or the first defense line, I guess, in his household. And then, a community should be made up of men who provide and protect that community. Do you
right.
think that is something that should be universal in terms of defining manhood?
You're opening up Pandora's box here, bro.
Yeah, well, it's tough, right? Because there's a lot of women who would push back against that in the feminist movement, and then also, in the modern world. I think this is a big part of the quote-unquote war on manhood is this idea of those values of providing and protecting. But I still, and maybe this is my primal mind not understanding, but I still associate those as universal. Whether you're an alpha male or not, I still feel like to be a man, you have to have that level of self-reliance, provide, and protect. You have to have all
right.
three of those.
Yeah, no, I agree with you, and I think there's also another piece of the puzzle here. I agree with you in terms of even like a biblical worldview of being the priest of your home or leading your home. Even if you take a look at a lot of different work, particularly, I know he's real sensitive right now, but Dr. Jordan Peterson, I just watched an interview with him the other day where he's talking about the reality is the vast majority of women still are looking to men to lead, right? I mean, there's still
no doubt about it.
it's ingrained, right? And I think that is absolutely true, to lead. And I do agree with you, the provision piece. But what are you providing? I don't think it has to be just monetarily. I think it could be providing emotional support, physical support in many regards. So provision, absolutely. But I think that's going back to what we began with. I think that's part of the societal problem, because the reality is, in many regards, brace yourself, men out there. In the 21st century, it's a blessing and it's a curse. Women simply don't need us as much.
Yeah.
Explain
that. What
I mean by that is, you're talking about the the difficulties of women today, right? If they do have children, it's really difficult. But they're working a career, so. And largely in today's society, women do not need men to monetarily provide for them as much as they have in the past, or really, in many regards, they don't need us at all. And so, I think that's part of going back to what we're talking about, is part of the problem. I think men in our society are unsure of their role, are unsure of who they are unsure of the goal, and they get lost in all this. So, I agree with you, they are to lead, they are to provide, but there's also another side of the story. Culturally, women don't need us. I mean, we can be just in many regards, we could just be a sperm donor, right? I mean, they don't necessarily need us economically like they have in the past. And I think if that's not looked at through a healthy lens of masculinity, men are going to be pretty confused. I mean, we see this. We've talked about this all the time. Like, how are men portrayed in even the media? I mean, and what I mean by media, I mean largely television. Either they're the Big Bang Theory dopes who can't even feed themselves or dress themselves or interact like an adult with anyone, and they need the girl across the hall to be their mother. Or you go to the complete opposite side, where this is exuberant macho guy who kills everyone or drinks a whole bunch of beer, has a whole bunch of sex, and is just an animal. And so, there's not many outlets for providing some type of true manly men in a healthy way.
Yeah. I agree with you largely that in many ways, just through the economic constructs of our society and just the way things have changed, women don't really need men anymore in terms of financial security. But where I would push back a bit, and maybe you would agree with this actually, is where society is telling women they don't need men, where they actually do, and that's primarily when it comes to raising a family in the household. You talk about men being perceived basically as but society would say what you said, but take it further and say, men basically are sperm donors. Look at the number of single moms in the world, and they do just fine. But the underlying truth to that is that they really don't do just fine. Not to any fault of their own, by the way. I mean, I was raised by a single mother for a period of time, and I know how hard that is. I can't even imagine, the sacrifices women make to raise kids on their own. However, you see the outcome of that 10, 15, 20, and 25 years later when those boys become men. That is the underlying current for many of society's ills. And it's because society is saying, well, we don't really need men. I think the role and the value of the father has been greatly undermined in the past few generations.
Yeah, absolutely. So, going back to, your notion of both leading and provision. And so, look, I mean, is it manly to stay home with your kids when your wife works a CEO job? I mean, that's an interesting question, but I think if we pare it back, it's the notion of men are needed, and they're not. Maybe they're needed less now economically, but they're absolutely needed to lead and help provide a healthy environment for the family unit. There's no question about that, and I think that's a major discipline and responsibility of men, is to be that father. I think this is leading into the essentially the second piece of the puzzle of the thread of manhood. So we're talking about the notion of society, but saying that it also leads into identity issues. And I think that's where we're at with this, is that I kind of have this pet quote of mine that you cannot be a man or a father if you do not know what it means to be a son. And so I think a lot of us have been brought up in these homes where maybe our father either simply wasn't there, or he was there and didn't really show men what it meant to be a man, right? And this has some pretty dramatic effects. There's a book written by Dr. Warren Farrell. The book is called The Boy Crisis. And in the book, he does some analysis at looking at some of the stats regarding boys in the country. Some of the stats are, for example, boys are 51% less proficient in reading, in math, in science than girls. Boys are 6 times more likely to commit suicide by adulthood. You are much more likely to be incarcerated if there's no father or father unit in the home. And essentially we're saying there's a crisis. Boys are feeling withdrawn and alienated. They don't know what it means to be a man. They don't have those goals, the discipline, the responsibilities laid out to them. And so, this has some pretty dramatic effects. Maybe some of your listeners aren't going to like this one, but many will. Well, you got to agree with it because it's stats. Something that the news isn't talking about is that in last several years, we've had some pretty horrible events taking place with mass shooters. And one thing that Dr. Farrell talks about, which I didn't hear on the news, is that there was 2 common characteristics to the men and the young men who committed the atrocities. One, of course, they have access to a gun, which I'm a firm believer in gun ownership, so I'm not going down that road. But the second piece, which I think is very telling, is that every single one of those mass shooters did not have a father or a man of some sort in the home. And I think that is, I think that is a major issue of there's an entire generation of boys who are fatherless, right? And they don't know. They just don't know how to process being a man.
Yeah, we were talking about this the other day, and that statistic kind of shocked me the first time around, and it still kind of shocks me, but it's hard. It's not hard to grasp. But what I've been thinking about since last time we spoke that got me thinking is, what, and I guess this kind of goes to, just the natural differences between men and women, but there's plenty of women who are raised in fatherless homes too, and they don't go out and shoot up, movie theaters and college campuses. So like that alone should show you that, the fact that boys are much more likely to commit violent crimes, especially when there's not a father figure around, should tell you that there's something primal, about men, that is aggressive, that needs to be properly channeled. And this goes back to this idea of, differences between the sexes that has to be nurtured at an early age. Because if you just treat this, as an egalitarian issue where men and women need the exact same treatment, you don't get the same results. You just simply don't. Like, men are much more violent. They're much more aggressive typically. And the statistics show that men are much more likely to commit violent crimes. They're much more likely to end up in jail, like you said. And a large part of that is probably violent crimes. And, if you don't have a strong male figure to look to in those early formative years, it can really do some lasting damage. It makes me think about this idea of the rite of passage for manhood. And I want to get back to this conversation about identity, but it just as a quick interjection, as a man, one of the, I guess, defining moments of your life should be that moment where you first realize that you are now a man, right? Where you realize that you're no longer a boy, that you are, a male leader in your society. You're respected as a man, whatever that means in your culture, whether that means that you provide and protect, or you have more social responsibility, in civics, whatever it may be. There should be a point in every boy's life where you're now a man. Yesterday you were a boy, now you are a man. A rite of passage. We really don't have that in the modern world. Our closest thing to a rite of passage is, graduating high school and going to college, or maybe, turning 21 where you can now drink beer legally, which seems kind of silly. You can go to war at 18. You can't drink a beer till you're 21. Or maybe it's when you can drive a car, when you get your license at 16 or 17, you know. But in any case, I think all of those are poor barometers of manhood. You know, traditionally, and again, giving kudos to tribal society, you know, there would be some sort of formal rite of passage. And it's not always violent like you might think or associate with stereotypes such as, you know, going out and making your first kill, or, you know, some sort of public, you know, ritual that usually involves some sort of bloodshed. But there has to be something, whether it be, you know, taking your kid out into the wilderness to, you know, backpack overnight and climb a mountain, or do something difficult like we were talking about earlier, just doing hard things. I've been thinking about this because I have a son. He's only 6 years old, but the time is going to come where I'm going to have to start treating him like a man and start shaping his identity as a young man rather than as a boy. And, you know, I'm already framing ideas for what his rite of passage will be because, you know, believe me, he will have a rite of passage, something definitive. I don't know what that is yet, but, you know, as I'm thinking about it,
come on, man. Give us some ideas. Give us some ideas. This is good.
Well, you and I have kind of talked about this offline before, and I think, you know, one good option would be, you know, proving that you can, you know, like you said, be self-sustaining for a period of time. So maybe that would be sending him into the wilderness on his own with, you know, a knife and a backpack, some basic provisions, but he needs to find his own, you know, sustenance. He needs to find his own way home. He needs to be out there on his own for a couple of days. You know, I have to be careful what I say publicly because, you know, some of this could really literally be deemed child abuse nowadays, but it's silly. I mean, honestly, like, as I talk about that, I'm kind of concerned that some people might, you know, perceive that as child neglect, but I think the absolute opposite is true, that this is what makes men men and young women women, is this clear, you know, point in time that they can look to as a reference. But anyway, I want my son to have that marker, whether it be sending him into the wilderness, you know, with nothing but a knife and a backpack, or maybe, you know, running with the bulls in Pamplona, something like that. I don't know what it's going to be yet, but there will be something that clearly says, yesterday you were a boy, you know, today you are a man. And society's lost that.
Well, we've kicked it back and forth about, I mean, it sounds pretty pretentious, but we have to come up with a better name for it. But you and I have kind of talked about creating man camp.
Mm-hmm. I still want to do it, man. Well,
I got a guy. Actually, my daughter's friend from preschools. The little girl's dad has 12 acres out in Montana. And so I was telling him about man camp, and he's like, he is completely in, bro. The keys are like hidden somewhere. I mean, it doesn't matter. No one knows where the heck it is, but he'll give us directions, and we can go out there and spend a couple weeks in the summer in his yurt in western Montana, and we can do man camp, bro. I got a place for us.
I'm in. When do we start? The thing is, we'd have to probably recruit kids from Montana because I don't think many parents in Pennsylvania are going to let us take their kids out to Montana for a week or two. But
you're an upstanding citizen. I mean, maybe we can start with some of our friends, you know, kids. Maybe we can make that happen.
Yeah.
But here's the thing, you know, if I said that, and I told my wife and I told my two girls that, you know, I mean, my one daughter is 3, the other is 5, and I'm telling you, the 5-year-old, you know, girl, Naomi, is going to be like, I'm coming. Mm-hmm. Like, she's going to want to do that, you know?
That's great. That's great. Who says she can't? I think that's great.
All right, man. So we'll have like separate tents or something for the boys and girls, I guess.
Yeah. I'm in. Let's do it.
Awesome. Maybe your listeners can you know, fork up their kids for 2 weeks and see if your listeners are in.
Yeah,
respond to the podcast Facebook page or something.
Yeah, I get random entrepreneurial ideas all the time, but this is one that, you know, I'm serious about. You and I have talked about this one, and then also starting some sort of like self-sustaining small farm, or, you know, just retreat commune type place, you know, where people can, you know, go out and experience a self-sustaining lifestyle. Now that might be a little bit more exclusive if that ever happens, but this one, you know, if we ever did this man camp idea, you know, ideally I'd like to target toward, you know, 10 to 14, 15-year-old boys, you know, and get them out there not only to do like physical tasks, you know, and discipline themselves physically, but also mentally, you know, challenge them with things like, you know, classic literature, poetry, you know, geometry, you know, anything, whatever it is, like anything that's a challenge to them, or perceived as, you know, irrelevant or unnecessary, or maybe quote unquote non-manly. Show them why there is value in that. Show that, you know, what a well-rounded man looks like. You know,
that might be
really important.
that might be a cool idea. You know,
I'm starting a business on air right now. You know that,
right? Yeah, it's awesome. Well, I don't want to say like, hey, have me on next time, but that could be a pretty cool follow-up if their listeners are into it. Like, just you and I bantering on, like, what would the curriculum of Man Camp look like?
Mm-hmm.
Like,
oh, trust me, dude. I've got outlines and scripts like
you
already
really?
like scribbled out. Oh yeah. I've been thinking about this for like 3 years, like to the point where I almost bought like a full size van a couple of years ago now, I guess. And I was going to start recruiting like the local middle school and just ask people for permission to take their kids for like 5 or 6 days and just go backpacking, and then just teach them not only survival skills but just teach them life skills, and read excerpts from like classic literature that's relevant to manhood and development, poetry, things like Rudyard Kipling's poem "If," things like that. We'll talk about it some more for sure. We'll talk about it on air. For those of you who are curious, we'll talk about this in another episode in the future if you want to get involved.
That'd be cool, man.
I want to talk. We talked about this, offline. We had some technical issues for those of you who are curious beforehand, where our recording wasn't working properly. But Dave and I spoke about another book, and I want to make sure we get this on air in this episode. It's called "The Masks That Men Wear" by Lewis Howes, and you gave a really nice overview on that book. And I want to jump back into that just for a few moments because I thought that was really profound the way you broke down these various masks.
Yeah, so this is underneath the guise of us talking about identity issues, right? So we talked about this boy crisis, and we can blame it all on the men that are not at home, and fine, that's fair enough. But the problem also may be the men at home, and this is for us dads out there, but not just us dads. It's really for all men out there to really get our identity in check. So. The book "The Masks Men Wear" by Lewis Howes is a fantastic book. He was like this big jock in high school and college, and he pretty much just found out that this guy playing various sports is simply a mask that he put on to hide his true, more or less wounded identity. And essentially what he says here is boys grow up not really getting a clear picture of what it means to be a man, right? We're told what not to do and not necessarily what to do. So, every single guy remembers the moment when either a dad or some other influential male in their life like went to him and said, stop crying. That's what girls do, or stop throwing a ball like a girl. All those kind of statements. And not to get all like, I don't know what the right word is, but to get all sappy on us. But essentially what he's saying here is that most men, if not all of us, put some type of mask on to hide our true self. Okay. And so he's got several masks, and I'll just go through them quickly. The first one is if you're insecure on your identity, you're going to put a mask on. And the first mask he talks about is the material mask. This is the male who has to drive the flashy car, has to have the expensive clothing, doing all of these outward signs to try to prove his self-worth and his identity of being a man to people. Another mask that some men put on is a sexual mask. This is the bro, right? The fraternity bro who's binge drinking and is doing all this promiscuous sex. I mean, we saw this all in the news, right? I mean, these horrible, horrible events of sexual promiscuity and really just flat out rape in college campuses is unbelievable. And it may not be that extreme in one's life, but you're fulfilling your manhood by sexual conquest. The aggressive mask, the guy who's always like quick to fight or is really aggressive in their emotion. They're putting this mask on, attempting to show their strength, but the reality is they're using that fake strength to actually mask their weakness in emotion. Another mask he talks about is the Joker mask. This is, very typical. You're talking to a buddy, you're talking to a friend, and, you're getting real with them. You're talking about issues, you're talking about things that they're doing, maybe talking about their emotions, trying to get in touch with who they are. And their immediate response is sarcasm and joking. This is the type of guy, when you go to talk with them, every response is some type of joke and some type of sarcastic reply, hiding who they are. My personal favorite, because they drive me nuts, is the know-it-all mask. Maybe that's because I'm a closet know-it-all. I don't know.
Yeah, you're a teacher. You're a teacher too, so you probably see it a lot.
Yeah. So this is the guy who either knows everything about something, or I think a lot of times it's seen in the upmanship. This is the guy who you're like, hey, buddy, my family and I, we just went on a vacation to Hershey Park in Pennsylvania. That's where I'm from, an amusement park. And the guy's like, oh, well, my family, we just went to Barbados on a cruise. It's the guy that's always one-upping you. That's a mask that's put on. Not to go through all of them because there's quite a few, but another one is the athletic mask, the guy who, hides his true self behind all the masks of having to be the football player and the quarterback and the star baseball player, trying to show his manhood through these things. So all of these masks are essentially ways in which really it's toxic masculinity, where men are trying to compensate their lack of true manhood and their lack of true healthy, holistic masculinity by putting these masks on. And the reality is it's going to continue, and it's going to continue with your sons. And I'm speaking as a father of 2 girls. I don't want your son to marry my daughter if that's what you're doing. It's just a reality, man. So, we need, as men, we need to remove that mask so we can show boys, what it really means to be a man. It's okay to have emotions. It's okay to be sensitive about things. It's okay to be unsure. It's okay to not be good at a sport, right? That just means that you have to maybe practice a little harder. Or you know what? Maybe you're just not going to be as good as the other kid. And that's okay, man. That's okay, son. I love you anyway.
Yeah. Well, what I was thinking and trying to frame, my thought properly was, and again, thank you for going through those, because as we talked through this last time, it was impactful for me hearing about all those different masks, because I could immediately, indict myself with a lot of those, as I'm sure most men listening could, but also I could think of other people with those same masks, right? And I guess I'd never really framed it that way before. So now I'm going back and doing a scan of all these people in my life as well as myself, and trying to figure out what's authentic and what's a mask. And my question for you as you're talking through that is, I guess, what does the man without the mask look like? Because in my mind, the man without the mask is a man who doesn't feel like he has something to prove, right? It's a man who's confident in who he is, secure in his personhood and his manhood, but somebody who probably walks softly, but carries a big stick, like Teddy Roosevelt would say, right?
Yeah. Well, I think so many of us, try to ask the questions in life of asking the question, what, right? So what is man? What is masculinity? But, I think that removes the notion of identity. And so I think a better question is, what is man? And the better question would be, who is man? Mm-hmm. And I think, I'm throwing the spiritual card out there. I think when we really know who we are in the relationship to God, that we have a better grounding for who we are. Like when we really understand what it means to be a son, or for your female listeners, a daughter of a heavenly being, right? All the other things of self-worth start to fall away. When I can say that my heavenly Father, even though I don't have an earthly father, but my heavenly Father says, I am well pleased in you. I've called you to be my son. I think a lot of the striving to try to prove your self-worth is removed. And so, I think that is the end-all, be-all. But, for listeners who may not have a spiritual grid, you put it into the context of essentially having your identity not in what you do, but the character of the man that you are. And, and I think this goes back to the things of of the discipline, of the responsibility, of character. You know, we prize people on their ability to make money for other people, but we don't really have a place in our society to praise men and women, but particularly men, for their character. And you know, I think that's the piece. You know,
that's interesting. I think the character piece definitely gets overlooked for sure and brushed aside. I think society, for one, kind of treats character, you know, as an afterthought, and then manhood. You know, again, the stereotypical views going back to all those masks. You know, it's. I guess the best way for me to frame it in my mind, just reflecting my own experience here, and you know, those of you listening might have completely different experiences, that there always seems to be like a prove it component to manhood.
Right.
Like you have to justify.
Exactly.
You have to justify who you are, right? Society expects that. Your peers expect that. And it's like, I have to prove it. So what you're saying is, you know, that weight's taken off your shoulder through, through your soul security, right? So like, if you feel like you have correct relationship with God, then that, you know, takes that burden or that yoke off of your shoulders and you feel secure. My question is, where does ambition fit into this? Is ambition a necessary evil? Is it just evil? Or is ambition something that we've kind of misconstrued? Like, for example, you know, in the modern world, especially in the 21st century, fast-paced, you know, capitalist society, we're expected to be self-driven. You know, you see that word pop up in job applications. You'll see it pop up, you know, in any pursuit you take on. It's a good thing to be a self-driven, highly motivated person, which translation, that just means a very ambitious person. Those people seem to get ahead. Those people are respected. However, and this is coming from a spiritual perspective, ambition is often frowned upon because it seems to be perceived as like being a busybody, being unnecessarily occupied with tasks that aren't essential, like being more concerned with the praise and esteem of other men rather than you know, values and virtues, and making sure your soul and your spiritual practices are in the right place. So my question is, as a man, what role should society play? And, you know, if we're talking about this idea of a war on manhood, you know, is society kind of pushing men to really dial down the ambition, maybe to make room for women, or maybe just to, you know, deal with this idea of quote unquote toxic masculinity?
Right.
Is there an overemphasis or an underemphasis on the concept of ambition, and how does that relate to manhood?
Yeah, that's a good and complex question. You know, I think, you know, we have to be very careful with ambition, because ambition, I think, for many men who don't have a healthy soul, can just become another mask, right? So we can put on the mask of ambition, you know, being a very ambitious go-getter, getting things done, whether it's in the workplace or whatever, and it could be essentially just another mask that you're putting on. So I think ambition can be a difficult one, but I think it's absolutely a manly virtue. But, you know, what about the ambition of the self, right? You know, having mastery over oneself, having mastery and discipline of, you know, in being ambitious to, you know, curtail your moral failures, your vices, your thoughts. What about that? You know, I think that's more telling of the longevity of manhood, is one who is ambitious to develop the character inside of them that is a better, how did I read it? A better version of the self, right? And I think that's something that, you know, various sports can teach you, but I feel like men need to be ambitious to become a better version of themselves. And I think that's in the workplace. I think that's working hard, working diligently, growing in favor before men, doing a good job. But I think it's also very much internal, right? Having control over your emotion and your spirit and your attitude and your outlook. You know, be like, you know, in many regards, like the Stoic philosophers, right? Having control, not in a really wacky way, but like having discipline over your mind and over your body. I think that's something, man, that like our society like just is not promoting when you take a look at the stats of health in the country and mentality of the country. So, I think men just really need to be ambitious in all aspects. You did an awesome podcast a while ago on Arate, man. That's still like wrecking me. You remember that one, right?
Yeah, I do.
And the excellence in all things. I think be ambitious in that. Leave the earth better when you leave than when you first got here. Teach your children, a better version of adulthood than what you got. Be the friend and the father that you needed when you were young. I want to see men be ambitious in those things, in addition to being ambitious in the workforce. But yeah, I think it's totally ingrained in us as men, and I think the confusion comes that men, due to their own masks and insecurity of their own identity, I think they just really put all of their emphasis, or a lot of their emphasis, on the ambition in the workplace, when they're forgetting about the ambitions and the importance of things at home and inside of their own soul. And I think that's where it needs to be redirected, so we can have some a healthier society.
Another quote that you brought up. Again, this is a convicting one, but it's by former President Teddy Roosevelt, somebody else that you and I both greatly admire. I'm pretty sure if you look up the word self-mastery in the dictionary, you'll see a picture of Teddy there. But the quote was, "At least fail while daring greatly, so that his place shall never be with those cold and timid souls who neither know victory or defeat." And that quote is pretty powerful, but it's also convicting, because I think mediocrity is a fear of most men. Again, it goes back to this idea of having to prove yourself to society, to your peers. Everyone's afraid of being average. We either want to, conquer the world, or we want to go out in flames so that everybody remembers us, right? We want to, have that lasting name or that recognition for something. And mediocrity is, terrifying. Honestly, it terrifies me. I think it's one of my biggest motivators in life. It's just to not go silently into the shadows. Like, I want to do something, that's going to be not only noticed by others, but something that's going to endure long after I'm gone. And, to build that, takes some ambition. It takes some discipline.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it.
And Roosevelt, for those who know his story, right, he's like super ambitious. Like, Teddy would read a book a day, allegedly. He would do jujitsu.
Brown belt in jujitsu. Yep.
Yeah, he had a mat, I think, in the basement of the White House or something crazy like that, and he would roll with people in the White House. So, do judo as well. Yeah, and everybody knows about his military conquests. And some people don't like Teddy because of that. Like, they see him as like the toxic, stereotypical male, but I really respect Teddy on a lot of levels because of the self-mastery, because of the way he lived life to the fullest, really challenging himself to the limits. And there's things that I obviously don't like about him, like the jingoism's kind of out of control, but Teddy is an example on so many levels of the ambitious, self-reliant man. And I'm wondering, as you look at that example and you hear a quote like that, where does that take you internally? Like, what place does that take you to in terms of how it convicts you, or what it makes you think about in terms of the man you want to be?
Man, I was struggling a little bit with the ambition piece, you're talking about, when you asked me that question. But I think, it just really, really hit me when you uttered the word mediocrity, right? I mean, I think that just may sum up the whole podcast. I mean, there are so many people out there that are just aimlessly being tossed to and fro in the waves of life, who are just surrendering themselves to a mediocre life. And maybe this is what it means to be a man, to stare mediocrity down and make it be your servant, and to step out of that mire. And so, when you read, right, there's something, when we read and hear these stories of Teddy Roosevelt or the greatest generation, Band of Brothers, and it stirs inside of us, man. It stirs inside of me. Like, I want to become a better version of myself tomorrow. I don't want to be one of those cold and timid souls who didn't go after greatness and go after difficulties and had that grit to overcome. I mean, I think maybe that's that's part of the definition of being a man, is staring down those things that are giving you troubles, those moral vices, those moral difficulties, and overcoming them. So yeah, I mean, you read something like that, man, you just want to go out and charge the next field. But that could be another piece of the puzzle, is that we in a society, we live in a very safe, a very comfortable, a very subdued society. We've gone back and forth and uttered that I don't know who stated it, but that quote that's reference to the Roman Empire. I don't know if you want to share that, or because I think that might really sum up, or not sum up, but really project us into that realm.
Yeah, so we talked about this last time we spoke.
You have a better memory than I, so you could be able to rock it out.
Well, I think this is accurate. If not, you guys can just look it up. There's like memes floating around on social media, I'm sure, about this. That's where I first saw it a year or two ago. But it's profound. I don't know who said it first, but it's this image, and it shows 4 stages. It's a cycle. And I wanted to get your thoughts on this, which you kind of just gave some of them, but I think we can dive deeper into this because this is really interesting. It says, so the first stage of this 4-part loop is hard times create strong men. And then the second stage is strong men create good times. The third stage is good times create weak men. And then the final stage is weak men create hard times. And then it just goes full circle back again. Hard times creating good men, hard times creating strong men creating good times, et cetera, et cetera. And it makes me wonder, are we constantly at the mercy of, just that endless cycle of, the ebbs and flows of history? Is there something to be said about conflict and difficulty being essential for the development of manhood, and for strong cultures and societies that persevere, overcome obstacles? People talk about, as you said, the greatest generation, that Band of Brothers, World War II generation, which, I use that phrase as well because I tend to agree with it. I think that's probably the gold standard when you're talking about American history. But, people also look to that era because of the Great Depression, and people having to learn how to live on, less means. And we look to those hard times as sculpting and crafting some of the best men and women that our nation ever, has produced. And I don't think that's by accident. On the flip side, we live in a time of abundance now, as I said earlier in the podcast, and it makes me wonder, are we at the mercy of our circumstances? Are we the result of a time of softness, a time of ease and leisure that has in turn made us soft? And will this lead to difficult times that many people are, predicting or forecasting in our imminent future in some cases, that will in turn eventually lead to harder, stronger, better men? Are we the victim of our circumstances, tossed to and fro on the waves of history? That's a big question, and it's something that, as I think about it, I don't know if I have a good answer for.
Yeah. When you were saying that, man, I remembered a quote that fits into this. And the quote goes, "Man cannot remake himself without suffering, for he is both the marble and the sculptor." And I think this is where we're at, man. I think we are living in easy times, man. It's good times on easy street. And I think for humanity, but particularly men, we need hard times. We need hard times to be molded into the image that we are to become. And, we don't have hard times. And I think that part of manhood is, and it's a totally different way of thinking about life. But I think men are wired, and this may be part of the problem, that we don't have it. But I think we need to actually, in our society today, purposely seek out hard times.
Yeah. Absolutely. Couldn't agree with you more. Guys like, Jocko, who's a Navy SEAL, will be the first to tell you war is hell. You should never wish war upon anybody. There's all sorts of unintended consequences, civilian casualties, all sorts of just devastating hardships and literally hells that you shouldn't wish on anybody. However, you learn things in war and merciless conflict that you can't learn anywhere else. And because of that, I kind of walk this fine line of not wishing those difficulties upon myself or my family or my country, but at the same time, kind of hoping for some difficulty in a way, because I feel like that will make us better for it, if that makes sense in some weird sadomasochistic kind of way. I think that it doesn't have to be something like, full scale war. That might be a little extreme, but we do need that conflict. I totally agree with you that if you don't have conflict, difficulty, challenge in your life, you need to seek it out. You have to immerse yourself in it. Yeah. And that's something I've been trying to instill for myself and for my son, just in general, is to put yourself in difficult situations. Do it on a regular basis. Something where you're going to have to think critically to find a way out, or you're going to have to really, bust your ass. You're going to have to break a sweat to get your way out of that situation. If you live every day in your comfort zone, you're setting yourself up for a world of hurt when the tide turns. And believe me, it will turn. We've all seen how quickly circumstances can change. And if you want to be prepared for that, if you want to be, confident in your ability to be self-reliant, then you need to subject yourself to that willingly. And that, I admire you for taking on that challenge with jiu-jitsu. You just threw yourself into that. Nobody told you had to. You did that same thing with running a couple of years ago, and to the point where you did a marathon. I mean, you just have that gene in you to subject yourself to trials and tribulations. And I think that's something that's been lost, but that's something that, needs to be reinstilled in humanity as a virtue to persevere through difficulty. I think the word you and I both used last time we talked was grit.
You're right.
We don't have it anymore. Grit is something that is kind of a fading virtue in society, but it's essential to the development of a strong civilization.
It's crazy. I mean, even as parents, right? I mean, we want to. I mean, we're kind of almost like ingrained in us to make life easier for our kids, right? I mean, we even have this whole American idea that like we want the next generation to have a better life than we have, and that's a good thing, and it's a good, we should do that. But I mean, you see with their kids, you want to bend over backwards for them because you love them and this, that, and the other thing. But I think a lot of it is that it's not that you love your kids, it's that you really love yourself, and you want them to bestow upon you some type of gratitude. But the longevity of it is that if you love your kids, you're gonna allow them to go through some difficult situations, right? Yeah. If you love yourself, I think you need to put yourself into situations. That's why I love this quote, for man is both the marble and the sculptor, right? So we are marble, right? We're these unfinished stones, right? But without war, without difficulty, tribulation, in our society, nothing is going to sculpt you. So now we are forced. It's crazy. We're forced to sculpt ourselves by placing ourselves, in difficulty. I mean, just like James chapter 1, right? Glory in all trials and tribulations, knowing that the testing of your faith will produce patience, that you be complete and perfect, lacking nothing. This notion of like difficulty, the furnace, man, forges you,
Yeah, that metaphor of refining fire, it's true. It really does. It challenges you. It makes you stronger. But the problem is, and since we're throwing quotes around, it seems a lot in this episode. One more that comes to mind is the quote that there's nothing in the world that's as sad as meeting a man who never knew his life was his for making. And that hit me like a ton of bricks the first time I heard it. I think it comes from Ray LaMontagne, who's a folk singer. But
oh yeah, man, Vermont,
some of the greatest truths you ever hear come out in folk music, FYI. But Ray LaMontagne, he said, there's nothing in the world as sad as talking to a man who never knew his life was making. And that hit me so hard because I feel like I lived like the first 25, 26 years of my life like that. Like I was just a product of my circumstances. Like, well, here's a job offer. I'll accept this. Never thinking twice about whether this is something I wanted to do with my life. Oh, I got accepted into this college. Okay, I'll go here. Never thinking twice about whether it's a good fit for me. Matter of fact, should I even go to college? I never had like these big questions, become a factor for me that I had to wrestle with. It was sort of just, this is the next step because society says so. And then I wake up one day, I'm 26 years old with a kid, I'm married, I have all these responsibilities, and it's like, oh, when are you going to take control of your life? Because guess what? If you don't do it, the world will happily do it for you. And that really, it hit me hard the first time I really had to come face to face with that reality. But it goes back to what you said, is that a man has to be self-reliant. He has to be the driver of his own boat. Like, you have to steer through that chaos, through that storm. Otherwise, the world will do it for you, and the world doesn't care about you. Newsflash, the world really doesn't give a damn. So you have to take accountability, extreme ownership, which is something I think Jocko Willink says, and you have to be responsible for your own fate. If you're going to fail, like that Teddy Roosevelt quote, then fail at least doing something. I'm kind of talking to myself right now as I say this, but fail at doing something worth doing, right? So society, we talk about this war on manhood, this persecution of masculinity. Well, that's part of it, is that we've let it happen to ourselves, right? We become victims of our circumstance. We're quick to point the finger at somebody else. Well, it's race wars, it's gender wars, it's lack of opportunity economically. It could be any number of things, but at the end of the day, your greatest enemy is the person you see in the mirror every morning. That's the only person you're competing against. You get up each morning, you look in the mirror, that's your enemy. That's who you want to be better than. That's who you want to compete against day in and day out. I want to be better than that guy, because that guy is a reflection of who I was yesterday. He's a reflection of my past. He's not a reflection of my future. And as long as you have that mentality, as you're challenging and competing against yourself rather than competing against the world, well then, the opportunities are boundless. Who knows what you can do. That's a road that you and I are on, and obviously we've got a long way to go on that road, but that's a road that is promising. It's challenging, and it's something that's going to motivate you to get up each morning, to get out of bed, to take on the world, in all of its troubles and all of its problems, is knowing that you are the master of your fate. Now, obviously, all of us are finite creatures. We all have limited abilities, but to give that ownership that you have, that freedom over so willingly to somebody else who will be so flippant with it, that to me is the ultimate sign that you are not yet a man. If you want to be a man, you have to realize that your life is yours for making and yours alone.
Whew. I think that would be a really epic rite of passage for a boy. Like, I don't know, it could be in the bathroom, it could be, out in the woods, but like, you just present a mirror to your son and you have him look at it, ask him what he sees, and then essentially walk him through that little, I don't know what you want to call it, speech or edification that you just gave, and be like, this is your rite of passage. Make war on yourself. You become a better version of who you are. And that's when a boy becomes a man.
Yeah.
Dude, when he sees that, when he sees who he is and says, the greatest enemy of great is good. I don't want to just be good. I don't want to just be mediocre. I want to become a better version of myself. I want to sculpt the marble, Dad. I want to get it done. Yeah. Dude, that'd be epic, man.
Yeah. I'm fired up for his rite of passage, and he's probably like 7 years away from it. But yeah, that's good stuff. Christopher McCandless, who a lot of people will know from his Into the Wild fame. If you ever read the book or saw the movie, one of the things that people don't know was that when he set out to Alaska, it wasn't just like this whimsical lust for nature and experience. Like, he was out there trying to prove something. He actually, one of the last things he wrote in his journal before he set out for Alaska, the trip that ultimately took his life, was he wrote in his journal, I now set out on, and this is a paraphrase, I now set out on the final quest to kill the false being within. And that's freaking powerful, to kill the false being within. Like, that's why he was out there. Like, he was trying to have mastery over his own life, to prove that he, could subdue all of his impulses that he thought were a sign of weakness, to kill that false being within. That's what we have to get back as a culture, as a generation, as a species, but first and foremost as men. We have to conquer that false being within and strive for something more, self-mastery.
Totally, man.
Yeah. So I don't want to keep this going too late or keep you on here too long, but something I want to talk about before we start to wrap up is, you talked about Jordan Peterson earlier on, and he really flew into the spotlight in recent times, talking about some of his ideas around, manhood and just current social issues and some of the problems that we face as a human race. And he has some very nuanced and very interesting ideas about, the roles of the sexes, as well as kind of his own unique commentary on why we have some of the social ills that we're currently facing. And one of the things that he brought into the spotlight, which isn't something that he discovered, but something that he really brought to the mainstream, was the realization of this whole subculture, or this whole subsection of men in the world who are referred to as incels, which is short for the involuntarily celibate. So men who would like to have relationships with women, but they don't, for whatever reason, because they're not, quote unquote, manly enough. Women don't like them. Women don't find them sexually attractive. So what they do is a lot of these men isolate themselves into, whether it be their college dorm room, their parents' basement, whatever, and they literally don't really interact with other people. And the reason why I'm bringing this up is because in some parts of the world, it's reached epidemic levels. And when I mean epidemic, some of the statistics coming out of Asia, Japan in particular, are insane. Like, I don't want to, misquote anybody here on the statistics, but the numbers are extremely high of men who literally just don't engage with society anymore, like don't leave their apartment. Some men, and this happens, with women too, but in a much smaller number, will literally die in their apartment and not be found for weeks or months because they never left. Like, people didn't know where they were, didn't know who they were for the most part. And, these people just live isolated, secluded lives, typically playing video games or spending, a ridiculous number in chat rooms or subreddits or things like that, never engaging with the world outside of a computer screen. And these are the incels. These are the involuntarily celibate. And apparently it's a large growing subset of the male population, largely triggered by, these changes in modern culture where men and the definition of manhood is shifting so much. The problem is that there's concern that some of these men who fall into this camp will become violent, that they'll start looking for some sort of expression for their frustrations that will manifest itself in dangerous ways. And we saw that, I think, for the first time last year or the year before, where somebody who was one of these quote-unquote incels drove a car through a crowded area in Florida and killed a few people. We've seen shootings. Some of these men identified as incels would be involved in shootings. A larger number would kill themselves. This still happens. Suicide rate is pretty high in this community. I think Vice News just did a spotlight on it. I saw something with another news anchor talking about it recently. I'm wondering, do you think this is kind of a foreshadowing of our future? Is this type of world where, this dystopian view where people never leave their room and they'd rather engage with the world behind a computer screen because they're afraid of reality, they're afraid of rejection, they're afraid of not knowing their identity, or having to figure out what their identity is? Do you think this is going to be a wave that just continues to grow until it's eventually a tsunami? Or is this something that, is there a better explanation? Is this something temporary that will eventually work itself out?
Well, I think that mankind is a social creature, right? So, there is this yearning and desire for community and interaction, right? I mean, so what I would hope is that, it would balance out, right? That we would have to balance out the equilibrium. With that being said, I mean, at the rate in which technology is going, I mean, we've had podcasts on it before, but, this notion of just being able to plug in, I mean, if incels are happening now in more technologically focused societies like Japan, I mean, what is it going to be like 20, 40 years from now when you can just, put on some virtual reality and you can have whatever desire and wish that you want, physically, sexually, emotionally. I mean, there's a potential of like major, like Matrix-esque kind of tendencies, I'm hoping it doesn't, man. And, maybe that's why we need stuff like Man Camp or people doing stuff or listening to this type of podcast. But I mean, I totally can see it like snowballing when the technology piece gets a little better. I think now like real, true reality still surpasses virtual reality in our expressions and and realities. But when the technology gets there, man, like it's like, it's an open book, man.
Yeah, I wonder if our future is destined to be a world where we all interact with the world through an avatar. You know what I mean? Like we all have this false portrayal or representation of ourselves, a mask, like you said, but on like a way grander scale.
Oh, yeah, dude. Wow. That's crazy. Yeah, like a permanent mask kind of thing.
Yeah. Like I could see that happening if society doesn't implode or take a step back into the Stone Age, or at least lose our Wi-Fi connection. Like I'm wondering if the future is going to be a world where, you see it now with social media, right? Instagram, Facebook, all that is, for the most part fake. And I try to step away from it now more and more. And I found that, my personal happiness levels go way up when I step away from that, because you don't feel like and we've talked about this on previous shows, you don't feel like you're competing with the world when you're just tuned out of that false narrative. The problem with Facebook and Instagram is that it's not real. Like most people don't live their life like that. Like I want to ask people all the time when I see their pictures, is this your day-to-day life? Is this really you? Like they're skydiving one day, they're traveling, to some exotic location the next, they're at a 5-star restaurant the next. Like you can tell that most people are just putting on a front. They're putting on a show. They want the world to perceive them in a certain light. The pictures are always taken at the best angles. Everything is perfect all the time, for the most part. A lot of people go the opposite way and put all their dirty laundry on there, which is equally obnoxious. But for the most part, it's a fantasy land where people live behind this avatar, this social media persona. And I wonder, if society is heading that direction, where at some point it's going to be feasible for us to never leave our never leave our bedrooms, never leave our apartments like these incels, and literally engage with the world through this false representation, this false portrayal of ourselves. And that, to me, is the most frightening of all worlds. That's the worst of all possible hells, because in that case, reality is dead. Man's connection from nature is severed.
Be very disturbing, man, if that's the way it happens. You just, I don't know. When you were talking like that, I just saw like a picture of like that little piece of, or that really annoying dandelion that pops out of like the pavement, know? And so the only thing I hold on to, man, is that like it seems to be that nature has a way, right? It has a way to overcome man's society and man's industry, right? I mean, you look at like those creepy pictures of Detroit where like the woods are now and the forest is just overtaking what used to be city, and I hope that there's some type of equilibrium, but I totally can see it happening.
Yeah. Let's hope that nature is merciful us when she swings things back into balance, as she always does. But let's wrap this up on a positive note. I want to talk about a path forward. I want to talk about what we can do. We've talked about some of this already, but let's reaffirm manhood. What are the small steps that we can do to win that war on masculinity, to reaffirm manhood in our own lives? One of the things that comes to mind for me is identifying with tribe, understanding who you are in your society, your group, your chosen group, whether it be your immediate neighbors, your family, your friends, a club you're part of, identifying with that, connection with other people, affirming relationships, affirming the structure of social dynamics. Like there's no better way to discover your identity than to help solve a grander problem or participate in some sort of project or activity. It makes you really learn who you are, whether or not you have leadership skills, whether or not you can, perform a task that other people may not be able to do. You need to throw yourself into those situations. So identifying with tribe, belonging to a group is really important. What other things come to mind for you in terms of reaffirming manhood?
Yeah, I think, I'm all jazzed up right now from that little epic speech you gave about looking in the mirror. But, I think, it sounds silly, but I think, it's very, when we're done, man, I'm going upstairs and I'm looking in the mirror and I'm going to wage war on the man that I am today and become a better version of self tomorrow. And so, I think that's, one little thing is being aware. And I think, doing that, I mean, take a moment and evaluate, like, am I the person that I want to be? And if I'm not, then what can I do to become that? I think coming to terms You know, take that mask off, man. Just take that mask off, and you don't have to show anyone else what you see. Show yourself, right? Take the mask off and start working on that. And I think that is something that you have to do. I mean, Shakespeare said it best, to thy own self be true. I think we need to do that, right? And the only way you're able to do that is if you become the only way you can take that mask off now to other people is when you become okay with what's underneath that mask. And I think the way to become okay with it, because society's not going to do it for you, you have to do it on yourself. You have to sculpt the marble, which is yourself. And so I think there are small steps that you need to do. I think we all need, as men, to place ourselves into some difficult situations, physically, mentally, emotionally, and we need to overcome that thing that we are, and we need to face that. And we need to develop the things which are discipline over mind, body, and soul. You and I, we need to walk out in responsibility and some semblance of self-reliance. And, you know, you're not going to become Davy Crockett or Teddy Roosevelt tomorrow, but start small. I think, you know, if you know, you need to lose some weight, well, maybe you should start there. And if you have, you know, anger issues, you know, maybe you should start there. What I do find is this, you know, our souls and our minds are like a fire, right? And so, you know, we may all want a nice big bonfire, right? But in order to have a nice big bonfire of life, you know, that real fire passion, you know, if you want to use the big epic fire as a representation of your greater self, you know, you need really big logs to get that going. And the reality here is you don't have a really big change in your life to be able to place on that fire and burn. So the wood is a kind of representative of the things that just need to burn up in your life, right? The little boyhood, the little things that you just need to let go. And so what do you do when you make a fire, right? Before you get to those big, huge logs, you have to start with some kindling, right? And as you place little things, just little things in your life that you're lacking in discipline, the fire and the passion of life is going to grow deeper in you, right? And then it's going to be that much easier. It's going to be that much easier to throw the bigger things on there. So I don't know, maybe you struggle with food, right? So, you know, hey, you don't have any discipline in your life. If you're struggling with food, you don't have discipline. You're eating things that you shouldn't be eating. Well, instead of completely going on a crazy diet, why don't you start somewhere small? Why don't you just, you know, instead of drinking soda at lunch today, you know, have some water, you know, just start something small. And what happens is, you know, I'm seeing this, my little experience this last week in jiu-jitsu is that if you just make a small little advancement, you become empowered, right? And now you're going to be able to do even bigger things, even greater things, you know? And so, you know, I think that's what, you know, a good place to begin is instead of beginning with your society is begin with yourself. I think start with the small things, slowly throw them on that fire and watch those flames just encompass everything. And another thing, you know, I think is very powerful, which I'm really working at. It's hard, but, you know, you are kind of getting to it, Josh. And that is, you know, it's been said, if I think it might be Tony Robbins or one of these self-help gurus, might even been Tim Ferriss, I'm not sure. But they say that if you want to know who you're going to be and what you're going to be in 5 years, take a look at your 3 closest interactions. And essentially what you're going to end up becoming is a cumulative average of the 3 people that are around you. And apparently this has been like proven intellectually, monetarily, physical fitness. Dude, you're talking about what tribe are you a part of? I think, dude, like if the 3 closest people around you are not people that you want to be in 5 years, I mean, I hate to say it, man, like you got to leave that tribe and you need to surround yourself with 3 to 4 guys that are a representation of what you want to be in 5 years. Because if you don't sculpt yourself, like you said, man, the world is going to sculpt it for you. And so, you know, go position yourself and be around people that you want to become. Be a part of that tribe.
Scary thing about that, too, is that if you ask most guys who the 3 or 4 closest men are around them, a lot of them probably can't even name 3 or 4. You know,
exactly.
Society will show that, especially in our generation, there's a trend, and maybe this has been going on for forever. I don't know, but men tend to get less and less social as they get older. Women, for the most part, tend to maintain some level of normalcy in terms of the relationships they have throughout adulthood. Men, on the other hand, will tell you that their closest interaction is usually their wife and then maybe one other male friend. But for the most part, most men over 30 don't really have multiple male influences in their lives, and that alone is a problem, which is why I would stress getting involved in a club. If you're part of a church, be active with men in that church. If you're part of a intramural sports club, that's great. It's a great place to start. But every time a TV show comes out that has to do with tribe, like, men flock to that because they want that, the ideal version of themselves. Yeah, it's part of that, right? So whether it's a movie like Platoon or Band of Brothers, a TV show, or something more recent like Sons of Anarchy, Motorcycle Club TV show, there's a reason things like that are always like #1 in the charts, and a reason why men are watching all that stuff, because that's what all men dream for themselves, being part of something bigger than themselves individually. Yet, and
finding their identity. Finding their identity in that. That goes back to our identity thing that we're talking about.
Yeah, I think you need that to find your identity, right? Because you can't. Ultimately, I think that it's true. You need to measure yourself always against yourself, but in order to be able to do that, you need to be in circumstances where you're being tried and challenged, and you really a lot of times can't do that unless you have other people around you, other people with different skill sets, different personalities. Are gonna force you out of your comfort zone where you can challenge yourself to be better than you otherwise would be. If you just are constantly in a room by yourself, you're not going to progress. It's like being your own, fitness trainer. If you want to get in shape, say you're 50 pounds overweight and you want to lose that 50 pounds, well, most of those people who are successful had a partner. They either had, somebody who lifted with them, went to the gym, went running with them, kept them accountable, or they hired somebody to do it. Whether it's a friend or a hired hand, you have to have somebody around you, because if you're trying to go on that journey alone, you're going to be easy on yourself. For the most part, we usually are too easy on ourselves. We let ourselves off the hook, and that's part of the battle, right? Is overcoming that obstacle.
Well, I think mankind was meant to not run alone. We're meant to run with other people. We're meant to do that. And part of the problem of manhood is that we have a hard time expressing those emotions and those ideas, and we mask it behind work. But dude, guys need friends. We need friends, and we need to be surrounded by people that are going to propel us forward. And so, look, you want to have ambition and work 50 hours a week. All right, go for it. I would say, dude, have the ambition, work 40 hours a week, and the other 10 hours a week, take care of yourself. Go do that hobby with other people, so that you can grow as a holistic being. Here's the thing, your sons and your daughters aren't going to give a rip when they grow up, if you lived in a $400,000 house or if you lived in a $250,000 house or a $100,000 house. Like, they're going to care about what did you show them, So I would just work less and take care of manhood, man. It's you may not care, but look, the future of society does, and maybe we need to change our man camp, man. We were talking about, like, hey, you get the junior high kids out to man camp. Maybe we need to do 2020, like, we're gonna have man camp, and it's gonna be all of us men coming together and creating a tribe. Like, we gotta create an eschaton tribe, dude, where we go out and and howl at the moon or something.
I'm on board with that. We might need a better name than eschaton, but yeah, we definitely need to get the ball rolling on that, because I think it's much needed for young men and older men alike. But wow, this has been a good conversation, man. It's always a pleasure and a blast when I have you on. People love having you on the podcast. So thank you for the wisdom you always impart. And for those of you listening, I hope that you got some light, some fire in this conversation that you can use to light your own torch and see through the darkness, navigate your way through the darkness in this war on masculinity, and find a way to persevere. Just remember that progress, that discipline is happiness, that if you want to get better, if you want to improve, that you're constantly doing battle with yourself, and that you need to ultimately find peace and find a sense of satisfaction with yourself. Your enemy is almost never external. Your first and most important enemy is the one that lives under your skin. So just keep that in mind. And as always, thank you guys for for listening. Thank you for all the feedback that you give and the support you give for this show. If you enjoyed this conversation, please give us a 5-star review on your social media or podcast platform of choice. And Dave, as always, man, thank you for joining us.
Thanks, man. It was a pleasure as always.
All right. Take care. We'll talk again soon.
Alrighty.
Before we wrap up, there was a poem that was mentioned a couple of times during this discussion that I think is worth reading in its entirety. Now, I'm not going to attempt to interpret it or decipher the meaning for you. I'm just going to read the poem, leave it out there, and let you make of it what you will. The poem is called If by Rudyard Kipling, and it goes like this. If you can keep your head when all about you are losing theirs and blaming it on you, if you can trust yourself when all men doubt you, but make allowance for their doubts too, if you can wait and not be tired by waiting, or being lied about, don't deal in lies, or being hated, don't give way to hating, and yet don't look too good, nor talk too wise. If you can dream and not make dreams your master, if you can think and not make thoughts your aim, if you can meet with triumph and disaster and treat those two impostors just the same, if you can bear to hear the truth you've spoken twisted by knaves to make a trap for fools, or watch the things you gave your life to broken and stoop and build them up with worn-out tools, if you can make one heap of all your winnings and risk it on one turn of pitch and toss, and lose and start again at your beginnings, and never breathe a word about your loss, if you can force your heart and nerve and sinew to serve your turn long after they are gone, and so hold on when there is nothing in you except the will which says to them, hold on, if you can talk with crowds and keep your virtue, or walk with kings and not lose the common touch, if neither foes nor loving friends can hurt you, if all men count with you but none too much, if you can fill the unforgiving minute with 60 seconds worth of distance run, yours is the earth and everything that's in it, and what is more, you'll be a man, my son.
And anytime you introduce fear into a logical process, whether it's linear, spherical, or otherwise, you're going to distort things.